Today's guest on Jules FM is Dr. Tim Sharp, better known as Dr. Happy. He's an internationally renowned leader in the fields of mental health and positive psychology, clinical psychologist and founder of the Happiness Institute, which is Australia's first organisation devoted solely to enhancing the happiness of individuals, families and organisations, as well as aiming to smash the stigma of mental ill health. A best-selling author, he's written several books, including 10 audiobooks focused on positive psychology, happiness and well-being, including The Happiness Handbook, and most recently, Lost and Found: How to Wander Your Way to a Better Life. Dr. Happy has dedicated his life to improving the happiness and well-being of others. Dr. Happy, or Tim, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I wanted to start by understanding how you first got into the business of happiness.
I first got into the business of unhappiness, to be honest. My background was in clinical psychology, which is what most people think of, I suppose. I was a clinical academic, so I was a therapist, researcher and lecturer. The first stage of my career was all about stress, depression and misery. It was all about where people were going wrong in life. And it was thoroughly satisfying. It was incredibly fulfilling, helping people overcome, some of life's greatest challenges. But about approximately a decade into that, I guess I saw the very early seedlings, the sproutings of what came to be known as positive psychology. And at that time, it was very new. No one had really heard of it. No one was really even talking about it here, especially here in Australia. And that's when I set up the Happiness Institute, partly as a way of sort of just waving a flag and trying to get attention and telling everyone how interesting I thought this thing was. And I guess that's when so that was over 20 years ago now. And that's when I shifted from, it was a gradual process, but from a more traditional clinical psychology life into a slightly newer at the time positive psychology approach.
All right. And I know you've been very open with your own challenges and battles with clinical depression and anxiety. Did that also impact that decision to move into positive psychology?
Not really, to be honest. It was more the reason I got into psychology in the first place. It was a bit of an accident, really. But when I left school, I didn't have a clue what I wanted to do, and psychology was the only thing that vaguely interested me. Particularly before that, in my late I'd always been a great lover of sports, and although I didn't really understand what it was, I kind of had this idea of sports psychology. Although I said it wasn't really very well defined, there wasn't really a career progression option back then in sports psychology. But that's kind of what I loved. I loved the idea of sports, and I suppose what then came to be called performance psychology. So when I saw the early inklings of positive psychology, it reminded me, and there were significant overlaps with what was also sort of referred to as performance psychology and sports psychology. So it was almost like, well, this is what I wanted to do originally, and clinical psychology was the closest I got to that. And I don't regret that at all. It was a fantastic career. But it was more going back to what I'd initially been inspired by.
Okay. And how did your challenges with mental health affect, what impact did that have on your life?
In some ways quite significant, and in other ways not that much, because I suppose I fought hard, I worked hard not to let them. Look, it's an interesting question, actually. People often say, did you go into clinical psychology because of your experience of mental health? I don't think I did. Well, not necessarily. I went into psychology because it was the only thing that really interested me at the time. And like I said, when I left school, I didn't have a clue. And so it was kind of a process of elimination. I knew what I didn't want to do. I didn't want to do building or engineering or law or commerce or medicine or any of these other things. And I was interested in human behaviour, although, as I said, I didn't really know what that involved. And then when I stumbled into clinical psychology, I suppose, you can't really separate the two, but it was the first time in my life when I thought, this is what I could do, this is what I could be good at doing, this is what I could enjoy. And so helping others, and then subsequently trying to help others experience less of what I've been through was certainly a motivating factor, and has continued to be a motivating factor, particularly in more recent years as I've become more of an advocate for mental ill health, I suppose. So, but I guess it's in some ways my struggles with mental health have motivated me to be more successful in a way. Maybe I've worked hard to try to overcome what I see as some of my inadequacies. So in that sense, it's possibly, again, I've worked hard. It's motivated me to be a success, to try to undo what I thought were my lack of successes in a way. But on the other hand, so it's meant that a lot of my success and achievements I haven't enjoyed them as much as I could have. Maybe haven't enjoyed many aspects of my life which I probably or possibly could have enjoyed more.
Yeah, it's almost like you were your own guinea pig. Like you could try out different strategies and techniques, and the ones that work might have greater success with others.
Oh, for sure. I've definitely tried to practice what I preach, and I've
Yeah.
had with greater or lesser success at different times. But yeah, look, so around the time, so when I finished my undergrad degree and I did an honours degree, I still didn't really know what I wanted to do then. So I had a 4-year degree with an honours in psychology, and I consider myself extremely lucky that just at the right time I was talking to one of our lecturers at the time, who in hindsight must have, I suppose, taken a bit of an interest in me. I don't quite know why or how it came about, but she suggested that I apply for the clinical master's program. And the deadline was, I think sort of a couple of days or a week away. And I'd never really thought about it because I didn't really know much about it. But I did apply for it. Somehow or other, I was lucky enough to be accepted. And again, when I started that course, the master's degree, I just loved it. I loved it from day one. It was really hard work because it was like any postgrad degree, and and I was living at home and I was working part time, so it's really hard work. And I remember it being a busy, sort of in some ways stressful time, but it was also incredibly satisfying and fulfilling for the first time in my life, feel like I had some clarity, some direction. And around that time, that was sort of the first time I was really discovering therapy for myself, I suppose, and finding a lot of benefits from that. So yes, I was both practicing it and learning it at the same time, and I think that was probably helpful.
Sounds like a great combination.
I think.
Now, happiness is often seen as like the goal in life, but it's not realistic, is it, to have happiness all the time? And so is there an optimal amount of happiness we should have?
Yeah, it's a good question. So no, it's not happy. It's not feasible to be happy all the time. Definitely not, especially not for me, I suppose. But that's why. That's why I often refer to the science of positive psychology, which is sometimes misinterpreted or sort of misunderstood as the science of happiness. I guess it all comes back to how you define happiness. But positive psychology, in very simple terms, is not just about happiness. It's certainly as it's understood as a form of positive emotion. Psychology has defined emotions as positive and negative for many, many years now. I don't necessarily like that definition because it kind of implies the negative emotions are bad, which they're not. But in simple terms, we have a whole bunch, all of us experience it. So we have a whole bunch of negative emotions, which are things like, stress, anxiety, depression, sadness, guilt, grief, frustration, anger. And as I said, these aren't necessarily bad. These are normal human emotions. And at times they're quite helpful and healthy. But then we also have a range of positive emotions. And happiness is just one of them. So it's a good one, obviously, but there's also joy and contentment and satisfaction and calm, etc., etc. So if we think about happiness as a form of positive emotion, then what the research is clear is that, one, that's really good. It's good to experience positive emotions, but it's not the only thing. And what positive psychology is really interested in and really is what we call thriving and flourishing. And that's a much broader, deeper construct, or a range of constructs, I suppose, which include the positive emotions. So again, it is good for us to experience happiness and joy. It's not just nice, it's good for us. But we also need to, if we're really going to thrive and flourish, we also need to experience positive relationships and positive meaning and positive communications and satisfaction and accomplishment. So there's a whole range of other constructs, all of which comes down to which points to the fact that, yes, it's good to feel good, but we also want to do good. And that doesn't necessarily mean feeling good all the time. If you've ever worked towards, I often ask this when I give talks and stuff, if you've ever worked towards a big goal, which all of us have at some point or other, maybe it was a university degree or completing some sort of training, or maybe it was a triathlon or a marathon or whatever it might be. You would have almost certainly experienced the fact that it's not always fun along the way. It feels great when we get there, but oftentimes along the way, there's blood, sweat, and tears, literally, metaphorically.
Yeah.
But that's okay. That's part of the process. And so I said, if we just focus on feeling good all the time, then what that will sometimes mean is we avoid discomfort. And that's not necessarily a good thing. We need discomfort if we're going to learn new things, do new things, if we're going to grow. So part of positive psychology is about embrace, and this is what a lot of Lost and Found is about. It's about embracing that discomfort, embracing uncertainty, so we can branch out and do new things and learn new things and become better.
Awesome. Yep, that makes a lot of sense. And it's kind of like that old saying, you can't know light until you've known dark as well. You have to understand, if we just had happiness or joy or any of those the whole time, we wouldn't really appreciate them, or they would lose their impact. And so,
well, it's also it's kind of almost a moot discussion, because it's just not. So the other question I've asked people: can you imagine a life where you never experience fear or anxiety? Or stress? It's just not possible. And the only possibility is you just lock yourself away in a bubble, and you never go out. Because if you go out into the world, there's going to be stress and anxiety and challenges and difficulty. But I think if you did that would create a different sort of stress, a different sort of discomfort. So, people say, do we need negative emotions? Do we need sadness? Well, I don't think that's even the question. The fact is, they're there.
Yeah.
And they're part of life. And as I said, and they're often an important part of life. So, grief is a normal human emotion. And what that shows us is that we love. Fear is a normal human emotion. What that shows us is that we want to protect ourselves and our loved ones from danger. So, whether we like it, we don't really have a choice in the matter. These are going to be here. We will experience them. We obviously don't want too much, though. We don't want them to be overwhelming and all-encompassing, and that's where the challenge is. So how do you accept these negative emotions as a normal, appropriate, dare I say it, healthy part of life, but not allow them to become overwhelming or to control your life? And then how do you build and create and foster and develop as much of the positive emotions and experiences as possible so that you can thrive and flourish?
Yep, it makes perfect sense. I know you've shared in the past a 4-step approach that you personally use to navigate anxiety and depression. Would you be able to walk us through that?
I think you might be referring to the RAIN acronym. Is that?
Well, the embracing perfection, mindfulness.
Action oriented. There's a couple of different models that I've used.
Okay.
So I guess, slightly different approaches. One of the model I developed more than 20 years ago now, when I first started to enter the field of positive psychology, is the CHOOSE acronym, choosing.
Yep.
So there's 6 letters in CHOOSE. But that came from when I first started to research positive psychology, and I read as much as I could, about thriving and flourishing, and tried to put it together in a compact package that everyone could sort of understand and apply. And that was so basically, it was about the fact that happiness is something you choose, and that was I kind of meant that in 2 ways. One, it's about taking responsibility for life. We don't have control over everything. There are many stresses and many challenges in the world that we don't have control over. You only need to turn on the news to see what some of them might be. But we do have control over some aspects, and we do have control over how we respond to or react to life's adversities. And that's where CHOOSE comes in. So it's about taking responsibility, but then CHOOSE stands for 6 key strategies, which, and again, I developed this more than 20 years ago, and I've reviewed it multiple times, but I think it's still very applicable. I don't think it's really changed. So quickly, so C stands for clarity. That's being clear about, having clear goals, being clear about your values. I think that's really important. Knowing what to say yes and what to say no to. I think a lot of people aren't as clear about those things as possible, and so they wander through life, get lost, get sucked into the sort of, what social media tells us to believe, or the news tells us to believe, and that's that's not necessarily the most helpful way. So C is about being really clear about who are you, who do you want to be, what do you stand for, what's important to you, and how can you live your life as best as possible, staying on that path. H is about healthy living. So that's about, and this is pretty kind of obvious in a way, but we need to be reminded of it. All of us could probably do better in this. This is things like exercise, eating well, and particularly sleep. Sleep's often the forgotten part of physical health, but it's hard to be happy if you're sick and tired all the time.
Yeah.
So these things, as simple and obvious as they sound, they're really important. And then there's a very strong link between physical health and mental health, which I think is often not given the attention it deserves. But taking care of those basic fundamentals is vitally important. And exercise is not just good for our bodies, but it's a very potent antidepressant and stress buster and mood enhancer. So that's the first O stands for optimism. Now it stands for optimism because that fits into the acronym, but more broadly it stands for mindset. And that's all that, it's about mindset, it's about optimism, it's about hope, it's about gratitude, all of that big cluster of psychological variables, which are all a bit different but all related. But the way we think about things, the way we think about us, the way we think about our world, the way we think about others, all of those things we know are fundamentally important, very possibly the most important thing. So, there's that saying that it's not what happens to you that matters, but how you think about what happened to you that matters, and that all comes under that cluster of optimism, which is not the same as positive thinking. It is about being positive, but it's also got to be grounded in reality. That's really important as well. So. And then the second O stands for others, which is super important. Real happiness isn't just about me, me, me. It's not about selfishness. It's just as much, if not more, about connection and relationships and community and belonging. In fact, if we look at the research, that's very possibly the most important contributor. I'd say probably is the most important contributor to health, to happiness, to well-being, to longevity, to all of these factors. And then, you don't need hundreds or thousands of friends. That's not possible anyway. You just need a few, even just one good friend. One or two is fantastic to someone that you can call when you need to, someone that you can talk to about things you can be honest with, be your real self with. So that's the second O, that's the others. The S is about strengths. If I go back to my background in clinical psychology, all of the focus was really about weaknesses. we learnt, to identify where people are going wrong with things and how to fix it. And that's okay. I mean, we all go wrong. We all make mistakes. We all have faults and weaknesses. And if we can correct them, that's a good thing. But we also have strengths, positive attributes, things we're naturally good at. And this is I thought one of the most exciting aspects when I shifted to positive psychology is saying not just, well, what's wrong with you and how can you fix it, but what's right with you and how can you make the most of that? How can you build on what you're naturally already good at? And that's something I think a lot of people overlook. We don't talk about that enough. And then the E, I can go into these in more detail if you want, but the E it's about enjoying life. I know I take myself too seriously sometimes. I take life too seriously sometimes. And life is serious sometimes. We all have responsibilities and obligations. But I think we often underestimate play and fun and laughter. And I try to remind myself sometimes to just lighten up a bit. And I think many of us could probably benefit from that.
Nice. I think my question from this comes from the S and the O, the O for others and the strengths. How important do you think it is to identify your gifts, your natural gifts, your strengths, and live in some sort of alignment? And for me, I often think usually that tends to be serving others in some way. I mean, how important then do you think it is to find, and have some sort of element of that in your life?
Oh, very important, and I like what I love that question, because what it does is it reminds me to make a point I often try to make, which is that each of those letters or each of those components interacts with the others. So as you said, maybe your strengths helping others, so that connects the S and the O. To do that in the right way, we need to be clear about our values, etc. So that even though I described each of them almost sort of in isolation, they really do interact. And to get the most out of all of them, we want to sort of use them together, I suppose. So the simple answer is very important. There's been a lot of talk in for quite a few years now about authenticity, which is great, which is obviously very, very important. But authenticity really is about, so if that's about being your true self, then a big chunk of that is identifying your natural talents, your natural abilities, or what we call our psychological strengths. You can't be you can't be your best self if you don't even know what your best attributes are. And I think that's the first part of the problem, is that most people don't even know what their strengths are. So you can't use them, you can't make the most of them if you don't even know what they are.
So how do people go about finding them then?
Yeah,
If you
well,
don't know.
well, one of the simplest ways is there's a great free test, and I'm not trying to sell anything
Yeah.
here, but the Character Institute, the VIA Character Institute,
Oh, yes.
is a well-established, well-regarded research institute that does some fantastic research and great work in this area. So, if you or if any of the listeners just search for VIA Strength Survey or VIA Character Strength Survey, you can do a free survey. You just put your put your email name and email in, and it asks you a whole bunch of questions. About what you love and what energizes you, etc., etc. There's 240 questions. I think they have a short version now, actually.
Yeah.
And then it sends you a report. So in that particular model, there's a couple of other different models, but I think this is the best one. And in that particular model, there are 24 signature strengths. And it will rank them from 1 down to 24. Now, number 24 is still a strength, it's not a weakness, but I suppose one way to think about it is you can't focus on everything, you can't focus on 24 strengths, that's a bit overwhelming. So what we can do, or what we can at least start doing, is focus on the top 3 or the top 5. And this, so this is one of the simplest things people can do. It takes about 15 or 20 minutes, but I'd say it's a fantastic investment of your time, because what you do, you'll get this report and it will rank you, and you can say, okay, let me just focus on the top. You can focus on any of them if you want, but focus on the top 5 and say, okay, well, how am I already using these? How can I use them more? How can I use them in different parts of my life? One thing some of us will do is use our strengths in the workplace, but not take it home with us, or vice versa. So one of the simplest things we can do is say, well, okay, I use this strength at work. How can I bring this home to my wife or my children? As a parent, say, or vice versa. There's a lot of people who at home are fun and playful, but they don't take that into the workplace. So, so doing that free survey, the VIA Character Strength Survey, is a great one. But we can also just ask ourselves, what do I love? What energizes me? What do I look forward to? So if you go into your calendar, for example, go into your diary and look at your next 2 weeks, which of those appointments or meetings are you really excited about? Or if you go back to the past 2 weeks or so, which meetings or appointments did you walk out of feeling really energized? In some way or other, the ones that energize you, the ones that excite you, they're probably pointing to a strength in some way or other. And so if you can then say, well, what's going on here? What was I using there? And then how can I do more of that? That's really, that's the secret.
Do you find that most people don't start asking these questions until, something happens? I know for me, I was teaching and I love teaching, but it just wasn't quite that fulfillment that and I don't think it was necessarily what I was sent here to do. But it wasn't until I lost my mum that I kind of went, hang on, that I questioned it. And I thought, is that common? Is that usually an impetus that there's some sort of trauma or drama in someone's life before they actually take a positive step?
Yeah, I think so. We know, if I go back to my therapy days, we know that people would often take years before people presented for therapy. It's not as though their anxiety or their depression just started yesterday and they walked in the door today. On average, it can literally take years. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for that. But yeah, one of them is that often, we've often got to hit rock bottom or have some significant challenge before we, threat of a partner leaving or losing a job or those sorts of things, which is a bit sad. So one of the things I've kind of fought my career, and a lot of us have fought, is to try to get people to come earlier and do stuff earlier. But that's there are a whole bunch of reasons why people don't. We tolerate a lot of stuff before we take that step. But the other part, so yes, often it takes some crisis point or some really significant event or loss. But the other reason, when it comes to strength, the other reason a lot of people don't think about this is that we just haven't talked about it for very long. Positive psychology has been around. It's been around for 20 years or so, but that's relatively new. When you think about the longer history of clinical psychology, and in clinical psychology, we just didn't talk about it. As I said, it was all about weaknesses. We're not taught this at school. When it comes to schooling and careers, there's a lot of focus, I guess, on skills and maybe talents, but they're slightly different. That's different to psychological strength. So it is catching up now. There is more talk about it. Some schools do have programs, and there is more and more public self-help type stuff, self-development work that does focus on it, but it's still a long way behind. And I've certainly tried to do my bit to promote the idea of strengths and using your strengths, and hopefully more and more people are starting to, because we all benefit. I mean, this is a great thing about it. So if you identify and utilize your strengths, you'll benefit, you'll be happier and more successful. But the people around you will, because you'll be doing your job better as a teacher or as a mum or as a whatever it is, even as a friend, where we can be a better friend if we're utilizing our strengths. So, it's really what can be a classic win-win, in that, I benefit, I feel better, I'm enjoying what I do more, and then all the people around me will benefit as well.
Oh, look, being in the education system still, I don't think I've ever had that explicit conversation with students where I think, or instruct them to look at what your strengths are. Instead, we talk about it, but they're never directed that way for a career path. They're always directed into, okay, positive psychology, yes, and we've done the VIA skill test, and that's great, and look at how you can use those. But in terms of life directions, it's just, it's completely overlooked. It's all about, all right, where are we heading? What uni are you going to go to, and what career and skill are you going to develop? So that's such a fascinating observation.
Yeah, well, you probably don't want me to keep ranting on about too much about this, but I think our education, so on the one hand, our education system here in Australia is fantastic. In many ways, it's very, very good, but in many ways, it's also very limited. And unfortunately, when it comes to post-school choices, too many people make their choices. But basically, if you get a high mark, you apply for the high mark courses, like law and medicine, and which, and that's not to say they're bad choices necessarily, but just because you're really smart and you get a 99 whatever, well, I suppose it depends which state you're in, obviously, but you know what I mean. If you get a really, that doesn't necessarily mean you're going to love law or love medicine, so we've still got a long way to go to try to help people understand that if you pursue your passions, and it's got to be, in a realistic way, it need to be financially viable and all those sorts of things. But basically, if you pursue a career choice that enlists and utilizes your strengths, you'll almost certainly be good at it. And if you're good at it, you'll be successful. And if you're successful, well, that's what we want, surely. But I think too many of us still choose courses based on our ATAR. Which won't always be wrong, but it also won't always be right.
Probably explains why there's so many people that change careers as soon as they, or don't go into that career when they're finished because they ticked that box, but then hang on, is this what I want to do? So it's a really important conversation to have.
Well, there's also a whole other discussion about that, and so I had another conversation with someone recently about this, which is that to think that we can choose a career for the rest of our lives. So if you're thinking, someone leaves school, say 18, roughly, and say they're going to work till 68. So the 50 years we're talking about. To think that you can just, that you would have the same job for 50 years, I think is a bit absurd, really. I think it's because also to think, are you the same person at 58 as you were at 38 or 28 or 18? Well, at 17 or 18, well, as I said earlier, I had no idea. I didn't know who I was. So the assumption that people that young will really will know enough about themselves and who they want to be. And then even if you do know, I guess, so even if you do know at 18, and some people do, and good luck to them. If there's anyone out there at 17 or 18 or 19 who says, this is what and fantastic, that's great. But to think that might not change, because, look, I'm a different person now. And, so many of us do change and we mature and our circumstances change. So even if you do find the right course at 18 or 19, fantastic. But I guess what I also encourage people to do is to be open-minded and think, well, maybe in 10 or 20 years' time, you might want to try something a bit different, and that should be okay. And I think it is obviously a lot more acceptable now than it was in, say, my father's generation or before. But it's still not quite as, it should be even more acceptable. I think the idea of changing careers and having portfolio careers or different careers is, I think, we've still got a little bit of a way to go with that area as well.
Now, you might not know the answer to this because I don't, but you might have a better idea. Do you think we all, on some level, intrinsically or whatever, know what our strengths are from like even young age, even though we're not consciously aware of it? Do you think we're all born with some gifts? I don't know. When does that revelation come?
It's a great question. So yes and no. I think what we do know is what excites us and what energizes us, and I think we do know that from a very young age, because we enjoy sneaky stuff. Uh, but then there's a couple of problems that stop, or a couple of things that limit us from then utilizing that further on. One of them is most of us don't have a language to think about or talk about these things, and that's one of the main reasons why. One of several reasons why I do recommend people do that VIA survey. If for nothing else, if all you get out of it is it gives us a vocabulary, so we can start talking about these things. Because people might have an inkling, but if you don't have words to put, if you don't have labels, then it just makes it harder. Whereas having a label or words or a vocabulary makes it a bit more tangible, which then makes it easier to do. So yes, I think we do know what kind of excites us and what energizes us, but if we don't have that language or vocabulary, it makes it hard. The other thing that our society gets a bit wrong, I think, there's many things our society gets wrong, but the other thing is that we often mistake, if something comes easily to us, we often discount it or underestimate it. And I think that's a pity, because if you have a natural strength, then by definition it sort of comes easily to you. But we then often denigrate that and say, well, if I didn't work hard for it, it's not worth anything. Well, working hard for something is worth something, but just because it comes easily to you, just because you're naturally talented at this or you're using this, that shouldn't make it any less valuable. And I think, I think too often we discount our strengths because they come easily to us and because we enjoy them, and I think that's a really sad loss.
Yeah, and I think for some people that if it comes really easily, they think everyone can do it.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Do you have any non-negotiables, habits or rituals that you use personally to maintain a positive psychology?
Yes, I do. I'm a big fan of habits, and I mean, you mentioned my audiobooks earlier. They're all based on the idea of habits. So there's habits for happiness and habits for happiness at work. So I do think that's really, really important. I will preface this, however, by saying that no one gets it perfect all the time. I certainly don't. So even though I've got all these rituals and routines, I still stuff up a lot of the time. I get it wrong. I forget things, and as we said at the very beginning, no one's perfect, so you're not going to get it right all the time. You're not going to be happy all the time. But yes, I try to do all of what we've talked about. So I try to exercise. I try to eat well. I prioritize sleep hygiene. I practice gratitude. I try to do all of the things I've spoken. I try to focus on my values, but I also. But the other part of that, as I said, is that I get it wrong all the time. And we will get it wrong a lot of the time, or some of the time. So what's then important, and possibly the most important kind of next step, is to practice a self-compassion. And that's the ability to say, okay, I've tried the best I can, I stuffed up, or I forgot, or I got it wrong, whatever. I'm not going to beat myself up on it now. And that's the big mistake I've made for many, many years. And a lot of us do make. And particularly for me, I say I should know better. I'm supposed to be the expert in this. Why don't I get it right all the time? Well, but for any of us, I think that's a mistake people make. They try to go to the gym and they go a few times, or they go for a few weeks, and then something happens and they don't go for a week, and then they beat themselves up. Oh, I'm stupid. I'm hopeless. I'm useless, and they stop going. Well, what we want to try to do instead is say, well, it's okay. Again, I'm human. I got sick, or I got busy with work, or whatever. I'll try again tomorrow or next week, or whatever the case might be. And so I think developing the habits for happiness is in some ways relatively easy, or certainly easier. We kind of most of us know what we should do or could do. And so that's kind of almost the easy bit. The next bit is how you pick yourself up once you've fallen over, once you've made a mistake. And self-compassion is about treating yourself the way you treat a best friend, or a loved one or a child. Would you, if they made a mistake, would you say, oh, you're stupid, don't, give up, don't ever try again? No, you probably say, look, it's okay, you made a mistake. Again, let's try again tomorrow. Give yourself sort of a bit of a pat on the back or a bit of a hug, literally or metaphorically. And then, that's all we can do, is do the best we can with what we've got and just keep trying and as often as we need to.
Yeah. I know this was something you developed some time ago, but I was really fascinated by your the positive or the happiness diet. And I wondered, do you still teach that, and what kind of results have you got as well? Like that was really, and if you'd explain it to start with.
Yeah, no, that's. I haven't done a lot of work on that for a few years, to be honest, because I got busy with other stuff. But to go, so for those who aren't familiar, that was, it was many years ago now.
Yeah.
I developed, so the happiness diet was in a sense a response to. I accidentally found myself working in an area with people who had various types of eating or weight disorders. So some were overweight, some were underweight, some had different food fetishes and whatever. And I became quite fascinated with this for quite a few years and developed the happiness diet in response to my interest in this. And it was basically a remedy for what I kind of discovered was this tyranny of when. So people would, say, I'll be happy when I've lost weight, put on weight, made more money, got a better job or whatever. And the idea was that if we say I'll be happy when, we're just constantly putting off happiness. We're constantly deferring it. We never get there, really. And even if we do, we then just move the goalposts further and further, I suppose. So the antidote to that was what I called the primacy of positivity. And that was about saying, well, if I put happiness first, real happiness, genuine happiness, if I put happiness first, well, then if I feel better about things, if I feel better about myself, I'm actually going to be more motivated to do what I need to do, whatever that might be, whether it's putting on weight, losing weight, eating better, whatever it might be. And there's some good research to support that in a number of areas. So the happiness diet came about as a specific version of the primacy of positivity, and we used that there was a TV documentary series that we did about that, which was fantastic. We got some great results, and then I did work on that for a number of years, but again drifted away from it when I got busy with other things. But basically the idea is it's not a diet in the sense of what you eat or don't eat. There's enough other people that are more expert in that, and again, to be perfectly honest, it's pretty simple, really. I mean, it's not that hard to just eat more real foods. I mean, I'm oversimplifying here and there. Again, there are nutritionists and dietitians who are expert in that, but there is a lot of expert advice about what to eat for a healthy diet. You don't need me to tell you, people don't need me to tell you. But what there isn't as much about is to how to feel good about yourself, so you feel worthy of that. So you feel because if I feel like I'm a terrible person or a hopeless person or I'm not very, well, then I'm not going to listen to that. I'm not going to eat. Why would I eat good foods if I'm not a good person, sort of thing. So this is about feeling like you're a good person first and foremost, so you will then do what you need to do. I hope that makes sense. Yeah.
Absolutely, and we use the same kind of philosophy with kids at school. Like, if there's a student who's not doing well, first thing we look at is, like, are they feeling connected? Are they feeling part of the community? Like, their happiness, which is great. So in some aspects, we're getting that right, because we know that a child who feels comfortable, safe and connected is going to do better academically.
It sounds very similar. Yeah, exactly. And I think that could be applied to all areas of life. And so most of my work in recent years has really been positive psychology in the workplace, building a positive culture. And it's the same thing there. People say, or some people say, well, what does it matter if we're happy at work? Well, it matters because exactly like you just described, if employees feel safe, if they feel comfortable, if they feel connected, if they feel part of a community, if they feel like they're doing meaningful work, then they work better. They're more engaged, they're more discretionary effort, they're more helpful, etc. So to me, it's a no-brainer that happiness, or real happiness at work, real well-being at work, should be a priority for any organisation. And it is for some, but I think there's a lot of organisations that could do a lot more and would benefit a lot more. And it's the same in schools as well. So that in schools there's positive education is what's the branch in a sense of positive psychology that's been well established for quite a few years now. And in fact, Australia's been one of the leading forces in positive education around the world. So there's some really great examples of where that's been applied well and some of the results it's having.
Fantastic. You spend your life giving lots of advice. Have you ever been given any standout, memorable advice that you remember?
Oh, lots. So, yeah, I mean, partly because I've been obsessed with this for pretty much all of my adult life. But I've been lucky enough to have some great mentors. I've been lucky enough to have some great therapists and coaches over the years. So I suppose I could answer that in lots of different ways. But what came to mind is the two things that have probably helped me most through my most difficult periods, to be honest. And one of the two things that when and I still go through some very difficult, challenging phases, some dark phases, and the two things that I keep coming back to are one. This too shall pass. So, particularly in my earlier days when I was suffering quite very severe depression, it wasn't just that I felt very depressed that was a problem, and that was bad enough. But I thought this would never end. I couldn't see any light at the end of the tunnel, and that's part of depression. Anyone out there that's experienced, and not just depression, but other forms of mental health as well. It's not just the anxiety or the whatever. It's that we can't see a life beyond that.
Yep.
And so, but thankfully, one of the things I've learned through experience and been helped to, is this idea that this too shall pass. So, so now, I'm not perfect at it by any means, but I've become, one of the things I've got much better at is in my really bad phases is to say, okay, I know this is terrible and it feels terrible and I can't see any way beyond it now, but I do know, because it's happened to me before, that at some point the clouds will lift. And I can, more often than not, I can remind myself of that because it's happened, 450 times before, however many times before.
Yeah.
So that's really helpful. It doesn't necessarily just make things magically disappear, but more often than not, I'm able to remind myself and reassure myself that at some point, this afternoon, tomorrow, next week, whatever, the clouds will lift and things will hopefully get a bit easier. And then, just as importantly, the other thing is to remind myself. The other great piece of advice is that I'm not alone, because again, particularly back in my early days, that was one of the worst things. Was not just that I felt absolutely, desperately hopeless and helpless, was that I thought I was the only person in the world. And this is going back many, many years. So we didn't talk about things as much then. This is before. It's before Are You OK Day and before Beyond Blue and before a lot of the fantastic initiatives we've seen in the last decade or two. But back then, as absurd as it sort of seems, I thought I was the only person in the world because no one talked about it then. And I thought reaching out for help was a sign of weakness and all these horribly unhelpful things that I now know are not true. So thankfully, I have an incredibly loving and supporting wife. Thankfully, I have adult children now who are supportive and understanding. I have a couple of good friends and siblings who. And again, I'm still not as good at it as I'd like to be. Many of us still struggle with this, but again, I have got better at realizing I'm not alone. Well, and I mean that, so that's in two. So one, I'm not alone in that I'm not the only person that suffers.
Yep.
And it's not that I want other people to suffer, but it is kind of reassuring to know that I'm not the only person in the world who's this messed up or whatever. It does make me feel a bit more, there's a comfort in knowing that this is a part of a human existence, I suppose, but also that there are people out there ready and willing to help if only I let them. And that's the problem, is not that they don't want to help, but it's that I often don't want to let them. But so that those two things. There's a whole bunch of other stuff as well, but those two things particularly have helped me and continue to help me, particularly through the dark days.
I don't know. I imagine it must be very isolating, and I think that's probably a really natural response to feel like you're on your own, and also probably it's the last thing you want to do is invite people in. But obviously, that's a great strategy, and to know that there are so many resources out there.
Yeah, well, again, if anyone out there has experienced depression or anxiety, and I'm sure people have, because we know how common it is. One of the symptoms of depression is social withdrawal, is isolation. So, so we know that's a part of the illness in a sense. But it's not a very helpful one.
Yeah.
It's a natural response to sort of close in and shut yourself away. But again, I have got a little bit better at recognizing that I'm doing that, recognizing it's not helpful. And one of the things that's changed in a positive way so much in recent decades is that I can now go online, and there are some. There are some great communities of social support. I actually just wrote a post the other day about how social media gets a bad rap in a lot of ways, and there are some bad, definitely. There's a lot of bad about social media, and a lot of, I spend too much time on it, and many of us do, and there's a lot of bad things, but there's also a lot of good about it, and so if we can curate our feeds to some extent, and so we can join there are communities and clubs and societies and where people support each other incredibly well. And it really is quite inspiring sometimes. So I can now, and then this didn't exist when I was younger, but I can now go online and go to certain pages or go to certain web pages and know that I can get good information or good support, or even just see other stories of people who have, come out the other end. And, so again, as bad as social media can be sometimes, there is a very positive aspect to it that I think, it's definitely worth acknowledging.
Absolutely. And I'll make sure I put some links to some of those resources in the show notes as well. On a positive note, well, what gets you up in the mornings? What's one thing you genuinely look forward to?
That's a great question. I don't know. Well, so when you asked that, it was the first thing that popped into mind was there's two, sort of my professional life and my personal life. In my professional life, I'm at a stage of my professional life where I've wound back a little bit. I still work. I still do a lot of speaking and writing, etc. But I'm also, and have increasingly, probably almost for the last decade now, tried to give back. So quite a bit of my work now is unpaid work, and a lot of it's mentoring, particularly young and emerging leaders in the mental health space, and also in some related areas that I'm passionate about, like the environment. So, and I've recently joined an advisory group for Lifeline Australia, which is so it's called the Lived Experience Advisory Group. So it's for those of us who have lived experience in mental health, feeding back into Lifeline's processes and policies and trying to help them develop those in a better way, guided by lived experience. So I guess it's those giving back, mentoring type activities that provide me incredible amount of fulfillment and satisfaction. To know that I'm helping, or to think that I might be helping others in some way, is probably the driving force. And then as I have wound back a bit, and I've started to develop a few other things in my personal liit's just doing more of, so this is apart from my family, I suppose, my wife and children, but it's spending more and more, as much time as I can in nature and bushwalking and hiking, and that's always been a passion, and now I'm able to spend a bit more time in the bush, which for me is very therapeutic. So that's it's good for me.
I think there's a whole study, isn't there, about how it can positively affect lots of people's psychologies to get that hit of nature.
Oh, 100%. So, Lost and Found, my latest book, the original working title for that, so when we pitched it to the publishers and when they accepted it, the original title was actually Get Dirty.
Yeah.
Which I still love. And it was very much about nature therapy and adventure. So it was about getting dirty in a physical sense, getting out and getting in mud. But it was also about getting dirty in a sort of psychological sense, which is about, about uncertainty and the unknown. And so the publishers actually, we signed the contract with that, but then when it got to the marketing department, they got a bit anxious that people might misinterpret it. So unfortunately, not unfortunately, so we went back to the drawing board and changed it to Lost and Found, which I still really love. I love the title of that. And I think it was a good way in a sense because it actually broadened the scope of the book. So I don't regret it at all. But there is, in Lost and Found, there's a strong theme of nature therapy, adventure therapy, getting outdoors. And look, there's no doubt that too many of us spend too much time doing what we're doing now, staring at screens, which is okay. Again, it's a necessary part of modern life, but almost all of us would benefit from getting outside. And it doesn't have to be bushwalking and hiking and camping like I do. Just get down to your local park, get down to your local beach, whatever. Just spending more time outdoors, ideally amongst green or blue, depending on whether you're near the coast, is undoubtedly helpful and healthy for almost all of us.
Makes me feel calm, relaxed just thinking about it. Final question is there something I haven't asked that you would like to share with listeners?
I think we've covered pretty much everything. So I think it's been some great questions, a great interview. It's been a great chat. Thank you. I suppose I'd go back to the idea, maybe just not new, but to recap a couple of things we have talked about, which is that one, it's not realistic to be happy all the time. It is a good thing to strive towards health and happiness and flourishing for sure. But we've got to be realistic about it. And all of us in some way or other will experience those so-called negative emotions like stress, depression, anxiety. These are normal parts of being especially a caring human being in a messy world. And so, so we do need to be realistic about that. We do need to accept that that's a normal part of life. And as I briefly touched on, the practice of self-compassion, so that when we do, lose our temper, when we do, drop the ball and mess up and get irritated or whatever, to be kind to ourselves, and others, and just get back and try your best again in the next minute or hour or day or whatever it might be. So, putting all of that, if you can put all of that together, hopefully you'll be doing pretty well.
Oh, thank you. It's such good parting wisdom to leave us with. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been fantastic, and I'm sure so many people will get so much out of this. So thank you again.
Thanks for your kind words, and thanks for having me.